Hey folks, it's Shane from Performance EV. Today we're going to start measuring up for our battery box. Hey folks, welcome to the channel. Thank you so much for joining us. For those of you new to this channel, this is my project to put a Nissan Leaf motor into a Porsche 911. And if that's the sort of crazy automotive stuff that you approve of, and you're not already subscribed, please consider subscribing. I try to get these videos out frequently and really go into depth about what I'm doing and why I'm doing things. And that's kind of why I'm doing this video. So I did a brief look a week or two ago into the kind of overall considerations for fitting the Leaf 40 kilowatt battery pack that I have into the Porsche 911. And I realized on viewing through that myself that while it was a good kind of high level overview of the considerations, there was so much more to it that I was having to work through. And over the last week, I've just kind of been going back and forth to the car every day or two, just looking at something different to try and get a better picture of what shape this battery box needs to be, what orientation the battery modules need to be in. So I decided, you know what, I'm going to film this and talk you through my thought process in a lot more detail when it comes to where the battery box components should be, why they should be there, and you know what sort of things need to take into consideration. Now I'm going to maybe a bit of overkill with this for this car because I want it to really drive like the 1998 Porsche 911 it was. They were, while lots of people had issues with them, they were well known for having very balanced handling and you know being quite a nice drive. And I don't want to ruin that by switching it to electric. As with most things in this project, it might be iterative. It might be that the first attempt I have at the battery box doesn't quite get it there and maybe throws some things out. And if that is the case, I'll go, you know, I'll revisit it and go and change things. But for this, you know, looking at it for the first time properly, actually having the battery modules, you know, there to look into how it fits in the Porsche is actually really cool. So I wanted to take you through what I'm doing in terms of considering how to fit it before we then go into, over the next few weeks, actually building the battery box. So I hope you'll enjoy this. I hope you'll join me as we go and look underneath the car, inside the car, and figure out where batteries could live for actually getting this electric Porsche 911 onto the road. So let's head and take a look. So our first step in figuring out the space that we've got down here for the battery pack is to basically get our bumper back in place in this space. So I've reinstalled the actual bumper bar. So this is the this is what actually protects you, or protects the car from any major damage in a small collision. This is what will take the brunt of the impact. That's in place, and we need to fit the bumper cover back on over that to kind of bridge the gap from here down to here. For the first time in months, we've got the rear bumper back on the car. Actually looks a lot more complete now. This is going to allow us to have a much better idea of the space we've got underneath. So let's go down and take a look. Now we know the space we're working with. We're going to have to actually figure out and mock up how things could fit. And in terms of being able to do that, we've actually got a few little handy tools that have been provided with us through the actual battery box itself. So I mean, first off, we've got the modules, the battery modules. So obviously this is what we're ultimately trying to fit, so I can use those to to try and mock up some, different orientations and how they might fit. They're not the lightest things in the world, so I don't want to have to do that too many times. We've also got the different mounting brackets that actually match the shape and size, certainly width and height anyway, if not depth, of the modules, so I can use those to kind of help it. So we've got both a single one and then one from where they were paired side by side, and between all of those I can really look and map inside the space I've got what might fit and what is going to foul on something and cause me problems, which I think is pretty cool. So this is the space we've got to work with, and as you'll notice, it's not a phenomenal amount of space. It's not exactly huge. And the other thing to bear in mind is that it actually angles upwards the closer to the rear you get. So that's to stop the rear of the car bottoming out whenever I go over a speed bump or something like that. Now, it's not quite as bad as it looks, because there is actually a little bit more give here, because the exhaust used to actually hang down slightly lower than this lip. So if you look at this picture that I've taken of another untouched 911 from the same year, there is actually a bit of a distance below this rear lip that you can actually go with the with this, and that works out as about 5 centimeters. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to space it out with a little bit of foam, and then I'm going to run some twine from here through to here, so I got an idea of the spaces I can work with, and then we'll start to figure out how that might look in terms of the battery modules. So here's the space we've got to work with. We've got our upper point here where we've kind of got the base of the area that we're going to have the inverter, high voltage junction box, and potentially a battery charger in the future. And then we've got our lower point here, which we don't want to go too much lower than, just to make the car drivable so it doesn't risk bottoming out. We've got all this space to work with, and we can go a little bit past this point here because the bumper is a bit further out, but obviously we don't want to go too much further, because we don't want something like the battery box to end up taking an impact. If we get in a low speed collision, you want the bumper bar to take the impact and not have to replace the battery box. So let's see how it'll fit. So what has me waving little bits of metal around taught us? I think the first key thing is that a battery in the upright position fits in this space absolutely fine. That you're probably only talking a single cell in height, or maybe a single cell with another one horizontal above or below it. The other thing that I find interesting is if we take two cells side by side like this, they do actually fit in the space okay until we reach the water cooling points for the motor. So this is where the inlets are for the water jacket that goes around the motor for the water cooling, and that is something that we're going to have to put in place. Now the question is then, how much of an impact is it? So at the moment it would actually be a really big impact, because not only do you have to take the fitting here into consideration, but you'd have to give an extra little bit for it to actually curve away from it. Now what I could investigate is, can I get a 90-degree fitting to basically turn immediately 90 degrees after here and then go upright, in which case that there is the limit of the issue, because it would be facing away after that. But you've still got kind of fouling happening here, so we'd need to see, is this something that could or should be removed, or what would we need to do with it to potentially make it fit. The challenge with doing it this way is we'd have the full 24 modules all hanging out here, which would be a considerable weight, and is something to think about. If we look at it the other way, obviously modules this way will fit, certainly one layer of them, but there is the potential to go up higher, and what I've done is I've marked kind of the two limits here of kind of front and back of the modules, so I can measure it in the engine bay and see, is there enough space, or in the upper part of the engine bay, to see is there enough space for me to lift this ceiling a bit to create the space to allow for this sort of orientation. This again may end up with some slight weight distribution challenges. We're not necessarily putting weight as far back in the car, but we're having it higher up, and we'd need to assess, is that going to have an impact on the drivability of the car. Again, this point here would decide how far back. We may end up, if you went with this, having it in kind of the center of the engine bay, obviously lifting it higher, trying to lift it higher to avoid this kind of hanging too low. The other option is to go for some sort of hybrid where you've got maybe just a single module up here, as far out as it needs to avoid that, and then you've got additional modules. So there's probably not quite enough space to have two modules like that end to end, but you could look at having the other modules in perhaps a slightly different orientation, either going like this, or even something like this, or a combination of the two, so having perhaps 2 or 3 layered up like that, and we can probably fit at least 3 across the length, possibly even 4, to allow them to to fit in this space. And then, of course, if you've only got the one here, there'd probably be space directly above it as well to fit that. And then if we look at a battery module itself, just to give an idea of the depth, if you were to do something like this, you could certainly fit 2 in this space here. But we'd need to assess, could you fit more? And then we've got our space back here. So, I mean, in terms of fitting cells, we'd need to look and see what could we do height-wise. And certainly in the middle, there's enough height for a couple of cells. And, you know, that space is there, at least in terms of two cells side by side. So there's a good chance you could fit maybe 4 cells side by side here. The question then is, could you fit perhaps 2 more in this space here? Looking at the width of these cells, I think it's closer to maybe 2 upright that you'd be able to fit. Probably 2 more horizontally, for a total most likely of 4 in this space. There's not really the opportunity to stack them on top of each other either. So we've got our string in place, slowly turning the car into a musical instrument, to replicate probably the lowest point that we want to go in terms of the floor, and getting an angle from the back to the front that should allow us to drive the car in the same way as it would have originally been driven. But I want to put another few marker points in here for my own reference. So one thing I want to look at is it's mainly around the center of gravity of the car, or of this part of the car. So the Porsche engine is a flat 6, which means that the center of gravity is actually quite low in the car, because the pistons and the heads and everything are in a horizontal plane, rather than like an inline 4 or 6 or a V8 or something like that, where it's more vertical and stacked on top of each other. So I don't have the engine currently, but what I do have is still the transmission. So I measured the where the transmission mounts to the engine, and got a few measurements of that from, I guess, effectively the base of it upwards. And what I want to do is mark both the center line of the engine, so basically where the crank of the engine would have gone into the transmission, and also the highest point of the transmission and engine mounting, because that's kind of the highest point of the main mass of the engine. The center of gravity of the engine is pretty much in line with the crank, so that will give me the information I need, just to see if my plans for where I want to put the batteries might end up pushing them too high or something like that. That would potentially screw up the center of gravity of the car. I did a fair bit of research recently just on this, and a lot of the information was really coming from people who'd done like LS swaps and that sort of thing in Porsches, and it can have an impact on the handling of the car if the center of gravity is too high up. Rear engine cars, it's a fine balance to get them to work, and one of the reasons the Porsche works, despite the fact the engine's so far back, is that it is that flat engine layout, which means that it's a very low center of gravity in the car. So I'm gonna put up my measurements. So basically I've got about 25 centimeters from the bottom of here is where the crank would have been, and then another 15 centimeters on top of that will take me to the top of where the original engine would have been. So there we have it. So this string here effectively is where the main crank of the engine would have been centered on, and that then takes the drive through the transmission and onwards, and then actually where I have the top of this bar here is more or less where the engine itself would have topped out, and after that it was all the ancillaries on top, such as the manifolds and all those sorts of things, or certainly the inlet manifolds anyway. So let's see how things look now that we've got that there. So it certainly feels like if we have the batteries in kind of this horizontal orientation, then the center of gravity is going to stay really, really low, as long as they're on a single plane. As soon as we start to move it up to include a second level, that increases the center of gravity, and we might be able to get that to fit and to work. But what we have to remember is I do have components up on top of this. So we've got things like the inverter up there. We're going to want potentially to store a battery charger in there, and that's going to add another 20, 30, 40 kilos high up in the engine bay, and that may end up causing us problems in the future. Certainly when the batteries are oriented in a more vertical fashion, they actually fit rather nicely below the center of gravity line, and would keep the mass well below the center of gravity of where the original engine was. It then becomes a question of packaging. So with these outlets here for the water pump or the coolant pump, it'd be quite difficult to fit the motor, or to fit the battery pack within the actual space of the motor itself. And we start to come too far towards the back of the car, which will have impacts on the the center of gravity again. Well, not the center of gravity, but the fore and aft weight distribution of the car. And again, that runs the risk of throwing out the handling. So what we could have is potentially a single row of batteries in this kind of upright position, and then look at perhaps having another handful also upright, but 90 degrees opposite in at least 2 or 3 rows, running along the width of the car to kind of stay within the space of the original kind of where the engine stood, rather than trying to bring it out too far back into kind of the bumper space. I had a look at kind of a lot of the details. So I had a look at quite a lot of detail about not just the overall weight of the whole engine, but also the weight of some of the individual components. So the engine itself kind of fit within this space here, and that was around sort of 200 kilos fully dressed. So that's with all the ancillary belts and things like the aircon and that attached, along with the exhaust headers and the intake manifold. The exhaust system itself was about another 40 odd kilos, and while that did stick further out into the space behind the bumper here, the actual weight of what was in this central section wasn't phenomenal. You're only talking maybe sort of 5 or 10 kilos. And then you had 2 large mufflers in this space here at about 10 kilos each. So it'd almost be safer to try to not go past this point here with the battery, but to try and potentially put a cell or 2 in the space to the side, assuming we can keep them safe enough in terms of the weight distribution. So while we've been talking about weights in terms of distribution, I haven't really looked at the headline weights. So while we've been looking at the weights in terms of weight distribution, we haven't really talked about the headline weights of the components. So I want to just talk about that quickly, give you an idea of what we had in there and what we're working with. I'm going to read this from my phone to make sure I get it right, but essentially looking at what we had in there previously, we have a Porsche 996 3.4 litre engine with all the ancillaries, exhaust, mufflers, attached to a Tiptronic gearbox. That's all been removed. If you have any interest in that, there is a video up above. But what did we actually remove? So I've been chatting to a few people on various forums about this, and there's kind of varying estimates of what the 996 engines weigh. certainly the naturally aspirated 3.4 ones, but I've gone with what the weights that I've seen most examples of. So the core engine, so that's the long block with cylinders, heads, all the ancillaries attached, as well as the inlet manifold and the exhaust manifolds, comes in about 205 kilos. On top of that, you've got the rest of the exhaust system and mufflers, which is somewhere around 40 to 45 kilos. And then the Tiptronic transmission, which comes in at about 125 kilos. The manual is actually quite a bit lighter. Makes sense. Automatic transmission's got a lot of moving parts in it and controls. So that brings us to a total of 370 kilos. About 250 of it is kind of behind the rear wheels, and 120 or so is in front of the rear wheels. What have we got? So we've got probably a slightly larger number of components. So we've got the motor, gearbox, inverter, and we're going to be putting the battery in there. So the motor comes in at about 60 kilos. It's a bit unwieldy to carry, but you can pick it up yourself. The gearbox is lighter. I think it's around 30 kilos. I haven't found a good estimate. When I break everything down for kind of clean up and final check before reinstall everything in the car, I'll actually get it on the scales and see what the real weight is and share that with everyone. Inverter is about 15-16 kilos. And then the battery modules, so there's 24 of them at about 8.7 kilos each, which comes out at around 210 kilos. So that gives us a total of 325 kilos. But what we are missing there is the battery box itself. So as long as I can keep that under around 45 kilos, then I'll be in a position where I haven't actually added any weight to this overall drivetrain. And this is where we then get back into the weight distribution point. So if we were to keep all of the battery box weight behind the motor, then we're ending up with the full, say, 250 kilos of the of the battery plus battery box, along with let's say a third of the engine mass, which is going to be 20 kilos, and the 15 to 16 kilos of the inverter. So that brings us at about 285 kilos, give or take, that we'd have behind the engine, versus 245 kilos that Porsche did. And that's kind of where we start to see the weight distribution errors in terms of how far back we have things. So ideally, we want to try and reduce the weight that we've got behind the engine and bring it further forward, which we could achieve by taking 4 to 6 of the modules and putting them in front of the motor where the transmission used to be, and that should then bring our weight distribution back to where it was, or where it should be. So these are the kind of challenges and things that I have to think about when I'm actually designing my battery box. So I hope you've enjoyed that kind of overview of where I am in terms of thought process and how I got there around building out this battery box. Over the coming weeks, we'll be going far more hands-on and actually doing the doing of, building the battery box, so cutting, welding, and all that sort of stuff. And I'm kind of going to take a build it in place type overview. So get the base into position and then figure out what the sides and front and back need to look like, take it down, get those built up, try and fit it again, and see how it kind of evolves in that way. So it won't be a quick thing, but it'll be hopefully enjoyable. But yeah, thanks for sticking with me on this video for this long. I really appreciate it. I hope you've gotten some benefit out of it. And yeah, if you've got any comments, any likes, please put them on there. As I say I do read the comments and try to respond to as many as I can. But I hope you've enjoyed this, and we'll see you next time.